Ever heard of the show A Thousand Ways to Die? Well, if you take a good look at our 300,000 years of human history, you'll quickly realize that 1,000 doesn't even begin to cover it. Try 1,000,000, if that's even enough. Throughout the ages, people have met some truly painful and horrific ends, some far worse than others. Thankfully, thanks to advances in technology and human progress, those brutal kinds of deaths have become a lot less common. Especially when you consider just how harsh life on ancient Earth used to be compared to now. We can only imagine the hardships our ancestors had to endure, but sometimes, we don't have to imagine. Every now and then, researchers get incredibly lucky, though often at the expense of a very unfortunate individual, and we get a rare glimpse into the catastrophic injuries ancient people suffered, and, in some cases, even survived. But the first case we'll talk about definitely wasn't one of survival. In fact, it's a type of death that still exists today, a shark attack. But not just any shark attack, this was the first confirmed shark attack ever recorded in human history. A grim title no one wants, but it belongs to a 3,400-year-old hunter-gatherer from Japan, known only as Tsukumo No. 24. The discovery was made in 2021 near the Seto Inland Sea, where researchers uncovered a male skeleton in shockingly brutal condition. His bones were absolutely covered in lacerations, from his arms and hands to his chest and abdomen. At first, scientists were confused and horrified by the severity of the wounds. They were so deep that they cut into the bone, resembling injuries caused by metal weapons, not animals or primitive stone tools. What made things even more puzzling was that the man belonged to the Jaman culture, which had no knowledge of metalworking. That ruled out the possibility of a metal weapon or some kind of ancient serial killer. So, the researchers took a closer look at the wounds, and that's when things started to make sense. The wounds were V-shaped, an unmistakable signature of modern-day shark attacks. Combined with the location of the remains, found on an archipelago, this led researchers to conclude that the man had been killed by a large tiger shark, or possibly even a great white. And this wasn't a quick or clean death. The attack inflicted a series of devastating injuries, each one fatal on its own. Every single rib had been fractured or torn apart. His chest and abdominal cavities were completely eviscerated. To make matters worse, he was also dismembered. Both feet and his left hand were missing. Interestingly, those missing limbs help reveal a crucial detail. The man had been alive when the attack began. The positioning and nature of the wounds suggest that he tried to defend himself with his hands and feet, likely using them to fight off the shark, only for them to be bitten off in the struggle. This ruled out the idea that the injuries came from scavengers after death and confirmed it was indeed a vicious, full-on attack. But that left researchers with a haunting question. Why was he attacked in the first place? What provoked the shark? Clues came from examining his injuries more closely. His left leg bore the deepest, most aggressive bite marks. This strongly suggested an ambush attack rather than any sort of provocation. Even more mysterious was where his body ended up. He wasn't discovered in the sea or a submerged area, but in a traditional burial site. His bones didn't show signs of prolonged exposure to water either. That meant someone must have recovered his body shortly after the attack and given him a proper burial. So what likely happened? Given that the Jaman people were known to be excellent fishers, researchers believe the man was part of a group that had gone out on a boat to catch fish. At some point during the excursion, he likely got into the water, perhaps to spearfish or retrieve a catch, unaware that blood from the fish had already attracted a predator. Without warning, the shark struck. Seeing their companion under attack, the others likely rushed to help, pulling him out of the water, but it was already too late. The injuries were too severe, and he probably died long before they made it back to shore. All they could do was bury him in accordance with their customs. Now, if you're planning a trip to Japan, don't panic just yet. Yes, sharks still live in those waters, but back then, the situation was much more dangerous. Fossil records show a higher number of shark teeth from that era, suggesting their populations were far larger than they are today. This is also reflected in Jaman art, which features depictions of various shark species, especially hammerheads and tiger sharks. Shark attacks may have been far more common during that time. Of course, this particular case ended tragically, but not every ancient injury led to death. In fact, some ancient humans not only survived catastrophic trauma, but actually thrived afterward. One such case, the world's oldest known amputation. This next story takes us back 31,000 years. For a long time, Researchers knew that amputations existed before modern medicine, but the oldest known case used to be only about 7,000 years old, a Neolithic farmer in Europe. That all changed in 2020, when a team of scientists made a groundbreaking discovery in Borneo: the skeletal remains of an individual who had not only undergone an amputation but had also survived it, long-term. The remains were found in the Liang Tibo cave, and the individual was notably missing their left leg and foot. At first, it was thought the limb may have been lost in a traumatic accident that proved fatal. But a closer inspection told a different story. The cut was surprisingly clean. It had healed well and looked intentional. Even more intriguing, the remaining portion of the leg was atrophied and child-sized, while the rest of the body belonged to a young adult, suggesting the amputation happened during childhood. Now, considering this took place over 30,000 years ago, it's highly unlikely they had access to painkillers. The procedure was most likely done using sharpened stone tools. And yet, the ancient surgeon somehow managed to carefully navigate around arteries, veins, nerves, and soft tissue, without causing a fatal infection. That's remarkable even by modern standards, especially since post-surgical infections still pose a serious risk today, with some studies reporting infection rates as high as 40% after major amputations. Even more incredible, the individual survived into early adulthood, eventually dying in their 20s from an unknown, unrelated cause. But that leads us to the big question: why did they need an amputation in the first place? One possibility is the rugged terrain around the cave. It's a mountainous area full of cliffs and jagged rocks. The individual may have taken a bad fall or been struck by falling debris, resulting in a severely damaged leg that had to be removed to save their life. And while it's believed they survived for nearly a decade after the procedure, that life wouldn't have been easy. Navigating that environment with only one leg would have been nearly impossible alone. That means this person must have received regular care and support from others, making this one of the earliest known examples of human empathy and community care. But of course, not all of ancient humanity was so kind. In fact, humans could be remarkably cruel, and if you caught my recent video on the Neolithic bottleneck, you already know just how horrifying that period of history could be. One of the most chilling discoveries from that era was found in the village of Saint-Paul-Trois-Châteaux in France. Back in the 1980s, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 3 women buried together. The remains were dated to roughly 5,500 years ago, and what they revealed was nothing short of gruesome. Recently, scientists revealed disturbing new insights into what appears to have been a brutal sacrificial ritual. In total, 3 women were found at the site, but 2 of them were buried in extremely contorted positions, crammed into tight spaces and completely covered by massive grindstones. The placement of these heavy stones was likely intentional, to pin them down, prevent any movement, and ensure they stayed buried. All signs point to the grim conclusion: they were buried alive, against their will. Even more haunting was the position of their limbs. Although their bindings have long since decayed, the arrangement of their arms and legs strongly suggests they were once tied up, so tightly, in fact, that their legs were bound to their necks, a horrifying position that would have slowly and involuntarily strangled them. This method eerily resembles a torturous technique still used by some branches of the Italian mafia, known as inapo. But while the mafia might use it as revenge against traitors, this Neolithic execution had a different purpose: agricultural sacrifice. The evidence: these women were entombed in a structure resembling a grain silo, with a third woman laid above the others, unbound and positioned symbolically atop the stones. It's believed her role was ceremonial, perhaps representing a deity or figure of reverence. Even the site's architecture held significance. It was built so that during the solstice, the sun would shine directly onto the silo. Whoever orchestrated this sacrifice may have been twisted, but they were also highly organized and deeply ritualistic. Now, for something equally unsettling, but far more mysterious, we travel to the other side of the world, to a death like no other. This case involves the only known prehistoric Homo sapiens ever found in a tar pit, the La Brea woman. In case you're unfamiliar, Los Angeles is home to the La Brea tar pits, an active paleontology site that's been a deadly natural trap for tens of thousands of years. The tar, sticky and hidden beneath a deceptively normal surface, would trap animals that wandered too close. Predators drawn by the struggling prey would also get stuck, leading to a grim chain reaction. These tar pits have preserved thousands of Ice Age fossils, including dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, mammoths, mastodons, American lions, and giant ground sloths. But among all those ancient remains, scientists discovered something truly rare, a human. The remains, believed to be up to 50,000 years old, belonged to a lone woman estimated to have been between 18 and 30 years old at the time of her death. Known as the La Brea woman, her skeleton is remarkably well preserved, consisting of a nearly complete cranium and partial postcranial remains. The La Brea woman's remains included a mandible and several postcranial bones. In life, she likely stood about 4 feet 10 inches tall, or around 1.5 meters, and lived roughly 10,000 years ago. Her teeth told a story too. Her diet consisted largely of stone-ground meals, which, while nutritious, had the unfortunate side effect of causing serious dental wear. It's likely she suffered from chronic tooth pain. But dental discomfort was the least of her problems. The real mystery, one that has puzzled scientists for years, is how she ended up in the tar pits at all. You see, the Paleo-Indians who lived in the area were well aware of the dangers these sticky, deadly traps posed. They avoided them for good reason. So for her to end up there suggested something more sinister. And indeed, forensic analysis provided chilling clues. Her jaw had been broken. Her skull showed signs of blunt force trauma, including a small puncture hole consistent with a powerful, deliberate blow. This wasn't the work of a wild animal. It was unmistakably human. If that's the case, then this makes the La Brea woman the oldest known murder victim in the Los Angeles area, by thousands of years. It's been suggested, though still debated, that she may have belonged to the Chumash people. But her killer's identity and motive remain unknown. Was this a conflict within her own community? A personal vendetta? Or was she the victim of a raid by a rival group seeking territory or resources? What's even more unsettling is the uncertainty surrounding her actual cause of death. Her injuries would almost certainly have been fatal, given the lack of advanced medical care at the time, but researchers still don't know if she died from the attack and was dumped into the tar, or if she was thrown in while still alive, left to sink and suffocate in the sticky, suffocating depths. Either way, it's a terrifying end, and one that still haunts the site today. Now, if that wasn't grim enough, our next story takes us to one of the driest, most inhospitable places on Earth, the Atacama Desert in Chile. Ironically, it's here that the oldest known case of drowning involving a modern human has been discovered. This Neolithic man, who lived about 5,500 years ago, made his home in this brutally dry landscape. Despite the desert's extreme aridity, he lived along the coast, where the ocean provided food, resources, and, at least in theory, life. His body was found in a circular stone structure, laid atop a bed of seashells, which aligned with the coastal culture he was part of. At the time of his death, he was between 35 and 45 years old, and his remains showed no signs of violent injury or disease. So how did he die? At first, the answer wasn't clear. But the seashells and proximity to the coast sparked a theory: he may have drowned. Still, the question remained: how could scientists possibly confirm drowning in a skeleton over 5,000 years old? So how do you determine whether a man who died over 5,000 years ago actually drowned, especially when all you have left are bones? Well, surprisingly, the answer lies in microscopic evidence. Scientists examined his remains for the presence of diatoms, a type of algae found in bodies of water. And sure enough, they found them embedded in his bones. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but it's actually a very grim indicator. You see, the only way diatoms can make it into a person's bone marrow is if they were inhaled into the lungs, causing the pulmonary alveoli to rupture. This allows seawater, along with the algae, to flood the bloodstream and eventually reach the bone tissue. In other words, this man didn't just die near water, he inhaled it. He drowned. A brutal end to what was clearly already a very harsh life. For starters, the man showed signs of advanced arthritis that had actually damaged his bones. His legs were heavily worn, suggesting a life spent in a squatting position, possibly while gathering shellfish. His arms and shoulders were also roughened and damaged, consistent with years of swimming, rowing, and throwing harpoons. All of this fits neatly with the theory that he belonged to a coastal foraging community. But if that wasn't enough, there was more. He was also severely iron deficient, something likely caused by a major tapeworm infection, which can happen if you eat poorly cooked or contaminated fish. So yeah, the guy had it rough. And just when you think the story can't get any more tragic, he didn't die alone. Buried alongside him were 3 other individuals: another adult male, a woman, and even an infant. Radiocarbon dating showed they all died around the same time. At first, this led researchers to believe that a natural disaster, like an earthquake followed by a tsunami, might have wiped out the group. After all, the Atacama Desert is in a highly seismic zone. But then came the twist. The other 3 skeletons didn't contain any diatoms. That changed everything. If they hadn't inhaled seawater, then they didn't drown, at least not in the same way. And so, the theory of a shared tsunami death started to unravel. Instead, the new working theory is that the man may have drowned by accident, perhaps while diving or foraging in deep water, while the other 3 died around the same time due to unrelated causes. Given how harsh and unforgiving the Atacama region is, that wouldn't be a stretch. Even without earthquakes or floods, life out there could kill you 100 different ways. And sometimes, as history has shown us, it wasn't just nature that made life painful, it was humans themselves. Need proof? Just take a look at the eerie remains of a group of 38 individuals found in France, each with carefully drilled holes in their skulls. And no, this wasn't some gruesome mass murder or the result of warfare. What you're looking at is something stranger, and arguably even more disturbing. You quickly realize that this wasn't some routine death. It was something far more brutal. But before we get to that, let's backtrack a bit, to the earliest known attempts at surgery, trepanation, also known as cranial drilling. Essentially, it involved cutting or scraping a hole into someone's skull, and it's believed to be one of the first widespread medical procedures attempted by early humans. The site in France where this practice was discovered dates back to around 6500 BC, making it one of, if not the oldest known examples of trepanation. But it wasn't an isolated case. Evidence of this intense procedure has been found at numerous other Neolithic sites, painting a rather gnarly picture of early medical intervention. Some studies suggest that up to 10% of Neolithic people underwent this treatment, which is wild. And in that particular French site, it was closer to 33%. Now, with such a high number, you'd think maybe it was somewhat safe, right? Not quite. Less than 40% of the skulls showed any signs of healing. That means over 60% of the people who underwent trepanation likely died either during or shortly after the procedure. The main causes: infection, massive blood loss, or the unfortunate outcome of the surgeon drilling just a little too deep and damaging the brain. Even if you survived the operation, recovery was a nightmare. Healing took months, and that's assuming you didn't get infected along the way. And let's not forget, this was all done without anesthetics or proper sanitation. Imagine being awake, lying still while someone slowly scrapes a hole into your skull using a sharpened stone, or worse, a seashell. And this wasn't just reserved for adults. Evidence shows that people of all ages underwent this: kids, teenagers, the elderly. Which raises a very important question: why? Well, the answer is kind of everything. Trepanation may have been used to release evil spirits, treat seizures or epilepsy, relieve pressure from head wounds, or even cure something as mundane as a headache. In other words, if you lived in the Neolithic era and complained about a migraine, better keep that to yourself, unless you wanted your skull chiseled open. And surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, this procedure stuck around. While modern medicine has made it infinitely safer and less horrific, versions of trepanation are still used today in very specific, life-saving situations. But speaking of pain, let's talk about Moor Girl, affectionately known as Mura, one of the many bog bodies discovered throughout Europe. And let's just say, her story is equal parts tragic and haunting. Mura was found in the year 2000 in a peat bog in what's now northern Germany. Initially, her remains were so well preserved that some thought she might be a modern-day missing person, perhaps a young woman who disappeared after a night out decades prior. But after further analysis, it was revealed that she lived over 2,000 years ago, during the Iron Age. She was estimated to be between 17 and 19 years old, and she had suffered more in her short life than many do in a lifetime. Her body told a story of repeated injury, hard labor, malnutrition, and possibly chronic illness. Just about every part of her skeleton had something wrong with it. And sadly, that wasn't even the worst part. So yeah, if there's one thing that becomes abundantly clear the more we dig into ancient remains, it's this: life was brutal. Take Mura, for instance. Researchers determined she must have lived a life of intense, daily physical strain, most likely hauling heavy loads like water jugs while trekking through soggy marshlands. Her bones told the story: chronic inflammation in her legs, spinal curvature from a benign tumor, and worst of all, 2 major head fractures that had healed over, proof that she'd suffered serious brain trauma and survived it. The shape of the wounds suggests blunt force, possibly from attacks, either by outsiders or, sadly, people within her own community. This kind of interpersonal violence wasn't rare during the Iron Age. So even after surviving these blows to the skull, she probably lived the rest of her short life with frequent headaches, neurological issues, and constant pain. Oh, and let's not forget the frequent sicknesses, chronic malnutrition during childhood, and the fact she only made it to about 19 years old, which, believe it or not, was below average life expectancy at the time, which hovered around 26. Now, how she died remains a mystery. There are no clear signs of murder or violent trauma at the time of death, so it's suspected she passed in a freak accident. But the unsettling part is that she was found naked and alone. No jewelry, no tools, no burial offerings, just dumped in a bog. Which leads researchers to think someone placed her there after death. But why? Were they hiding something? And even in death, Mura didn't get peace. Her remains were accidentally dug up and torn apart by industrial equipment before anyone even realized what they were unearthing. She had to be painstakingly reconstructed, piece by piece. And if all that wasn't enough evidence that life was relentlessly harsh, we now have what is believed to be the first known victim of the plague, a 5,000-year-old hunter-gatherer from what's now Latvia. He died around age 20, likely after being bitten by a rodent carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacteria behind the bubonic plague, the Black Death, and other infamous outbreaks. That little bite. It sparked a biological chain reaction that would go on to kill over 100 million people throughout history. Talk about a horrifying legacy. And speaking of horror, the Neolithic era doesn't just give us stories of disease or famine, it gives us a grim highlight reel of human-on-human cruelty. Many skeletal remains from that time show clear evidence of cannibalism. Others were dismembered, decapitated, stabbed, bludgeoned, shot with arrows, burned alive, and sometimes a lovely combo of several of those. And it wasn't always just one unlucky person. Over 100 mass murder sites have been unearthed around the world from this era, showing just how much ancient humans excelled in large-scale violence and creative cruelty. So yeah, the past. Definitely not a vibe. For all the chaos in our modern world, the reality is this: life today is, in many ways, far more merciful than what our ancestors had to endure. We've got antibiotics, food security, painkillers, laws, usually, and a whole lot less skull drilling. Maybe the takeaway here is that, despite all the problems we face, we've come a long way. So until next time, stay safe, be grateful you weren't born 5,000 years ago, and maybe, just maybe, keep your head away from anyone holding a stone knife. Thanks for watching.